All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating historical argument from the book, The Architecture of a Downward Spiral. We're going to unpack its core idea about a massive, and I mean massive, transformation in early Christianity.
So let's just get right to the core question, the big mystery here. How on earth did a small, often persecuted Jewish sect manage to become the official state religion of the Roman Empire in just 300 years? It's an incredible question, and it sets the stage for a really dramatic story of change.
I mean, just look at the contrasts on this slide. It's night and day, right? In the first century, you've got these small gatherings in homes, shared leadership, everybody participating. Flash forward to the 4th century, and you've got these grand imperial buildings, a single powerful bishop calling the shots, and a professional priesthood. It's a totally different animal. So how did they get from point A to point B?
Well, to really get this, the source material argues we have to go back to the beginning, to what it calls the original apostolic blueprint.
So what did this blueprint look like? Well, according to the book, it was defined by a few really key things. Leadership wasn't one guy at the top. It was a team of equal elders. There were only 2 recognized roles, elder and deacon. And there was this idea of a universal priesthood, which meant that all believers were considered ministers. And maybe most importantly, the whole model was supposed to be about serving, not dominating.
And what's really key here, the source points out, is that this wasn't just some nice idea they came up with. It's grounded directly in what Jesus himself taught. He drew this sharp contrast between the power structures of the world and this new kind of community he was creating. Greatness wasn't about having authority over people, it was about being a servant. That was a radical idea then, and it's still pretty radical now.
Okay, so now that we have a picture of that starting point, the so-called apostolic blueprint, let's get into the meat of the argument. The source identifies 4 major interconnected shifts that it claims explain how everything changed. And here they are. The book breaks it down into 4 huge game-changing shifts. First, a new way of governing. Second, the creation of a whole new class of people called clergy. Third, a very deliberate break from the faith's Jewish heritage. And fourth, a new understanding of where authority actually comes from. So let's take a look at each one.
First up, the rise of the monarchical bishop. That sounds fancy, but it just means the move away from a group of equal elders running a church to a single, powerful bishop who had authority over an entire city or region. This is a fundamental change in the whole power structure.
Now, one of the main guys pushing for this change way back around 110 AD was a man named Ignatius of Antioch. He was adamant, saying nothing church-related should happen without the bishop's say-so. But the source makes a really interesting point here. The very fact that he had to argue for it so passionately suggests it wasn't the norm yet. It was a new and probably controversial idea.
And this chart just lays out the differences so clearly. You can see the shift from a plurality of leaders to just one bishop. Authority goes from being based on a person's spiritual gifts to being based on a formal ceremony of ordination. And the whole theological justification changes, from Christ being the one and only head to the bishop being seen as God's representative on earth. The ripple effects of this were absolutely massive.
All right, shift number 2. This one's called the invention of the clergy-laity divide. The argument here is that a special, professional class of clergy was created, setting them apart from the ordinary laity. The source claims this whole idea is totally missing from the New Testament, which taught that priesthood of all believers we mentioned earlier.
The big idea that drove this is something called sacerdotalism. It sounds complicated, but it's basically the belief that priests are a special spiritual class who act as the necessary middlemen between God and regular people. The source points to Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century as the one who really organized this idea into a system, making the priest and the bishop the essential gatekeepers.
Okay, this third shift is, well, it's a tough one to talk about. The de-Judaization of the faith. This was a deliberate and systematic effort to strip away the faith's Jewish identity. It's so important to remember, Christianity began as a thoroughly Jewish movement. The source calls what happened next a legislative parting of the ways.
And you have to understand, the source says this wasn't just some cultural thing that happened over time. No, this was enforced by official rulings. You can see it right here. Around 306, a council forbids Christians from even sharing a meal with Jewish people. In 325, the famous Council of Nicaea separates the celebration of Easter from the Jewish Passover. And by 363, another council actually outlaws resting on the Sabbath, calling it Judaizing.
And if you're wondering about the motivation, well, this quote from a letter by Emperor Constantine himself right after that Council of Nicaea is pretty stark.
He says, "We desire to separate ourselves from the detestable company of the Jews." The source argues that this kind of hostile attitude coming from the very top was a huge driver of this separation.
And that brings us to the fourth and final piece of this puzzle, the elevation of tradition over Scripture. This is all about how unwritten church customs and teachings started to gain an authority that was equal to, and often in practice even more powerful than, the written Scriptures.
You know, the source makes this really striking comparison here. On the one hand, you have Jesus in the Gospels calling out religious leaders for putting their human traditions above God's actual commands. Then, on the other hand, you have the post-apostolic church creating its own sacred tradition to support practices and beliefs that weren't in the Bible. The argument is that it's the exact same pattern playing out again.
So there you have it. 4 massive shifts. A new governance, a new clergy, a break from Judaism, and a new authority. So what's the bottom line? What does this all add up to? Well, the book makes a really crucial final point that's key to understanding the whole argument.
And here's where the book's argument gets really nuanced. It says, this process was one of corruption, but it wasn't annihilation. It makes the case that even though these institutional changes were severe, they didn't completely wipe out the original, core apostolic faith.
And to get this idea across, the book leans on this powerful metaphor from the Apostle Paul about a building's foundation. The idea is that the foundation, Jesus Christ himself, is unshakable and can't be destroyed. What happened in this view is that people came along and built on top of that solid foundation, but they used shoddy materials, hay, wood, stubble. The foundation wasn't lost, it was just buried under layers of other stuff.
So to wrap that idea up, the argument we're looking at isn't for a great apostasy. The idea that the true faith just proofed out of existence. It's arguing for a series of traceable, documented shifts away from that original blueprint. The core was buried, not completely lost.
And that really leaves us with this big, lingering question, doesn't it? One that goes way beyond ancient history. When any institution, whether it's religious, political, or even a company, starts to drift away from its founding principles, what does it actually mean to stay faithful to that original foundation? That's definitely something we're thinking about.